Long before the United States of America existed, the land was wide, wild, and full of life. Great forests covered the east, long rivers flowed through the valleys, and open plains stretched farther than the eye could see. For thousands of years, Native American tribes lived on this land. They built villages near water, hunted animals for food, and grew corn, beans, and squash in the soil. Families gathered around fires at night, telling stories about nature, spirits, and brave ancestors. Each tribe had its own language, clothing, and traditions, but all respected the land as a gift. Everything began to change when large wooden ships appeared on the ocean horizon. European explorers crossed dangerous seas looking for wealth and new lands. Some came for gold, others for adventure, and many came hoping for a better life. In 1607, English settlers built the first permanent colony at Jamestown in Virginia. The land was unfamiliar, the weather was harsh, and food was scarce. Many settlers became sick, and some died during the first hard winters. They did not know how to farm in this new environment and depended on Native Americans for help and knowledge. Slowly, the settlers learned to survive. They planted crops, built stronger homes, and traded with nearby tribes. More ships arrived from Europe, bringing families, workers, and supplies. Over time, 13 colonies grew along the eastern coast of North America. Small towns became busy ports. People worked as farmers, blacksmiths, fishermen, and shopkeepers. Churches and schools were built, and communities began to feel like permanent homes instead of temporary camps. Although life was improving, the colonies were still controlled by the British king across the ocean. England made laws and demanded taxes on sugar, paper, tea, and many other goods. The colonists felt these taxes were unfair because they had no representatives in the British government. They said it was wrong to pay money without having a voice. Protests began in the streets. People refused to buy British products. Some even dumped tea into the harbor in anger, an event later called the Boston Tea Party. Tension grew between the colonies and Britain. British soldiers were sent to control the angry population. Fights broke out, and trust disappeared. Ordinary farmers and workers started talking about freedom and self-rule. Newspapers printed bold ideas about independence. Meetings were held in homes and churches where people discussed the future of the colonies. By the early 1770s, many colonists no longer wanted to live under British control. They dreamed of a new nation where people could choose their leaders and make their own laws. Fear mixed with hope as everyone realized change was coming. The peaceful colonies were moving toward conflict, and the path to independence was about to begin. The anger in the colonies continued to grow, and soon words were no longer enough. In 1775, the first battles broke out between British soldiers and colonial fighters in small towns like Lexington and Concord. Ordinary men left their farms, shops, and families to defend what they believed was their right to freedom. They did not have strong weapons or training like the British Army, but they had courage and a deep love for their land. The colonies needed a leader who could unite them. George Washington was chosen to lead the new Continental Army. He was tall, calm, and respected by soldiers from all colonies. From the beginning, the war was difficult. The army lacked food, clothes, and medicine. Many soldiers walked barefoot in the cold, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. Some became sick, and others lost hope, but Washington encouraged them to keep fighting. The British Army was powerful and well organized. They won many early battles and captured important cities like New York. It seemed at times that the colonies would lose. However, the American soldiers learned to fight in new ways, using forests and surprise attacks instead of standing in open fields. Farmers turned into warriors who knew the land better than their enemies. In 1776, colonial leaders gathered in Philadelphia to make a bold decision. They wrote the Declaration of Independence, a document that explained why the colonies wanted to separate from Britain. It said that all people are born equal and have the right to life, liberty, and happiness. When the document was read to the public, bells rang and crowds cheered. The colonies were no longer just fighting for better treatment, they were fighting to become a new nation. The war continued for many years. Winters were cold and deadly. One of the hardest times was at Valley Forge, where soldiers had little food and no warm clothing. Many died from sickness instead of battle. Yet those who survived became stronger and more disciplined. They trained every day and grew into a real army. Help soon came from France, which sent soldiers, money, and ships to support the American cause. With this help, the Continental Army gained new strength. Battles became larger and more intense. Towns were destroyed, families were separated, and lives were lost on both sides. Finally, in 1781, American and French forces surrounded the British Army at Yorktown. Trapped and unable to escape, the British commander surrendered. The fighting slowly came to an end. 2 years later, Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States. People across the colonies celebrated with joy and relief. After years of fear and suffering, they were finally free from British rule. Fireworks lit the sky, church bells rang loudly, and families hugged each other in the streets. The United States of America was now a new nation, born from struggle and sacrifice. But freedom brought new challenges. The young country still needed laws, leaders, and unity. The journey had only begun, but the dream of independence had become reality. After gaining independence, the new United States began to grow quickly. People were hopeful and full of dreams. Families moved west in long wooden wagons, traveling for weeks and sometimes months across forests, rivers, and wide open land. They faced storms, hunger, and danger along the way, but they continued forward, believing a better life waited beyond the mountains. Small settlements slowly turned into towns, and towns became busy communities with schools, churches, and markets. The government bought new land and added new states to the nation. Roads and railways were built to connect distant places. Farmers planted crops on rich soil, and traders carried goods between regions. The country seemed full of opportunity. However, this rapid growth came with great suffering, especially for Native American tribes who had lived on the land for generations. As settlers moved west, many tribes were forced to leave their homes. Soldiers marched families away from their villages, making them walk hundreds of miles to unfamiliar territory. Many people, including children and the elderly, died from hunger, cold, and disease during these journeys. One of the most painful events was later called the Trail of Tears, a name that reflected the sadness and loss of thousands of lives. While the nation expanded, another terrible injustice continued: slavery. Millions of African men, women, and children were held as property, not as human beings. They worked long hours on farms and plantations, especially in the southern states, growing cotton, tobacco, and sugar. Their lives were filled with pain, fear, and separation, as families were often sold apart. Even though America spoke about freedom, many people were not free at all. Some Americans believed slavery was necessary for the economy, while others believed it was evil and against human rights. Brave men and women began to speak out against it. These people were called abolitionists. They wrote newspapers, gave speeches, and helped enslaved people escape to freedom through secret routes known as the Underground Railroad. One of the most famous helpers was Harriet Tubman, who risked her life many times to guide others to safety. Tension between the northern states, where slavery was mostly banned, and the southern states, where it was common, grew stronger each year. Laws were argued over, protests increased, and political leaders struggled to keep the nation united. Every new state added to the country caused a fierce debate about whether it would allow slavery or not. Families and friends began to disagree. Churches split apart. Newspapers attacked one another with angry words. The nation felt like it was slowly tearing in two. By the late 1850s, fear and anger were everywhere. People realized that compromise was becoming impossible. The question of slavery was no longer just about laws, it was about the soul of the nation. The United States stood at the edge of a great conflict, one that would decide whether it would remain united and whether millions of people would finally be free. The tension that had been building for many years finally exploded in 1861. The United States was no longer one united country. The southern states broke away and formed their own government, calling it the Confederacy. They believed each state should make its own laws, especially about slavery. The northern states, known as the Union, believed the nation must stay together. Neighbors became enemies, and families were divided by loyalty and belief. Young men rushed to join the armies on both sides. Many thought the war would be short and easy, but they were terribly wrong. The first battles were loud, chaotic, and deadly. Guns filled the air with smoke, cannons shook the ground, and soldiers fell by the thousands. Fields that were once peaceful farms became places of blood and sorrow. Life as a soldier was harsh. Men slept in mud, marched for miles in worn-out shoes, and ate little food. Disease spread quickly in crowded camps, killing more soldiers than bullets did. Letters from home were treasured, reminding them of families waiting in fear and hope. President Abraham Lincoln led the Union during this dark time. He believed strongly that the country must remain united. At first, his main goal was to save the nation, but as the war continued, he became more determined to end slavery. He knew that freedom was the true meaning of the American dream. In 1863, Lincoln announced the Emancipation Proclamation. This declared that enslaved people in the Confederate States were now free. Although it did not end slavery everywhere immediately, it changed the purpose of the war. Now the fight was not only for unity, but also for human freedom. Thousands of formerly enslaved men joined the Union Army, fighting bravely for their own liberty. The war dragged on for 4 long years. Battles like Gettysburg and Antietam were some of the bloodiest in American history. Entire towns were destroyed. Families waited for news, praying their loved ones would return alive. Hospitals were filled with wounded soldiers, and doctors struggled to save lives with limited tools. Slowly, the Union Army gained strength. They blocked Southern supplies and captured important cities. By 1865, the Confederate forces were exhausted and running out of food and soldiers. Finally, their leader surrendered at a small town called Appomattox Courthouse. The terrible war was over. The country was saved, but at a terrible cost. More than 600,000 soldiers had died. Homes were burned, and the South lay in ruins. But slavery was finally ended across the nation. Millions of people were legally free for the first time in their lives. Joy and sadness filled the streets together. Bells rang in celebration, yet families mourned those they had lost. America had survived its greatest test, but healing would take many years. The nation now faced a new challenge, rebuilding itself and learning how to live as one people again. After the Civil War ended, the United States slowly began to rebuild itself. Cities in the South that had been destroyed were repaired, farms were replanted, and families tried to return to normal life. Newly freed African Americans searched for education, work, and a chance to live with dignity. Schools were opened, and many people learned to read and write for the first time. Although freedom had arrived on paper, real equality was still far away, and discrimination continued to cause pain for many generations. As the years passed, America changed quickly. Factories rose in large cities, producing steel, clothes, and machines. Trains stretched across the country, connecting the East and West like never before. Immigrants arrived from Europe and other parts of the world, hoping for opportunity. They worked long hours in difficult conditions, but their efforts helped build the nation's growing economy. Skyscrapers touched the sky, and streets filled with people chasing dreams. The United States soon became involved in world events. In the early 20th century, it joined World War I, sending soldiers overseas to fight in Europe. After the war, the country enjoyed a period of growth and excitement, but it did not last long. The Great Depression struck in the 1930s, leaving millions without jobs or homes. Families stood in long lines for food, and hope seemed lost. The government created programs to help people survive and rebuild their lives. Not long after, World War II changed the world again. American soldiers fought in Europe and the Pacific, and factories at home worked day and night to support the war effort. After victory in 1945, the United States emerged as one of the world's strongest nations. Life improved for many people, with new homes, cars, and technology shaping modern living. Yet the fight for justice was not finished. African Americans still faced unfair laws and segregation, especially in the southern states. In the 1950s and 1960s, the civil rights movement rose to challenge discrimination. Brave individuals organized peaceful protests, marches, and speeches demanding equal rights. One of the most famous leaders was Martin Luther King Jr., who spoke about a dream where people would be judged by character, not skin color. These efforts led to important changes in the law, ending segregation in schools and public places and protecting voting rights. While struggles continued, the nation took major steps toward fairness and equality. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, technology transformed life again. Computers, the internet, and smartphones connected people across the world. The United States became a center for innovation, entertainment, and culture. Today, America is a nation of many backgrounds, languages, and traditions. Its history is filled with moments of bravery, mistakes, learning, and progress. The country continues to face challenges, but it also carries strong ideals of freedom and opportunity. The story of the United States is not finished. Each generation adds a new chapter, shaping the future just as those before shaped the past.